Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thank you for coming out for our Thursday night programs here at the museum for the Science Cafe. I see lots of familiar faces here tonight, but is there anyone who is at the Science Cafe for the first time? Just welcome. Thank you for coming. Glad that you're here. And thanks to everyone else for coming out and visiting with us on a Thursday night. During the State Fair, you people really like science and technology, or you really don't like the State Fair. Anybody gone to the State Fair yet? Gonna go see it? You really do like science. This is the perfect crowd. Well, tonight for the Science Cafe, we're going to be talking about something of which I cannot have an experience with. Unless, of course, I am married, and if we had children, perhaps it could impact my life, and so I'm going to be paying attention to tonight's talk on postpartum depression. But this is something that would uniquely, directly affect women. So that is who I'm going to have speak to you tonight. Not me. Normally, I have a lot to say about the topics, but tonight, I think I'll leave it just that here at the Science Cafe, at least recently, I feel like we've done a very good job in working with our partners like UNC School of Medicine, who have helped bring us tonight's speaker. We're finding people who are passionate. They see a problem in society, or they see an issue, or they see something that is affecting people's lives in a very real and sincere way, and then they focus all of the attention and energy that they have to solving those problems. And then we invite them to the Science Cafe, and we get to learn a little bit about what drives them, what these problems are, and then, most importantly, what sort of solutions they're coming up with that are changing our lives on a daily basis. So tonight we have Dr. Samantha Meltzer-Brody. She's from UNC School of Medicine, the Center for Women's Mood Disorders, and she's director for the perinatal psychiatry program at UNC. So put your hands together, give a warm welcome to Dr. Meltzer-Brody.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here and brave the I-40 traffic coming from Chapel Hill. And to talk about postpartum depression, I have been working in this area for 15 years almost exclusively, and it really is a privilege and honor to be able to take care of women and their families that suffer with this condition. So I wanted to share with you some of the work we've been doing at UNC, some of our research, and what we see as of innovative clinical care. Advance this. There we go. Whoops. Went to the end already. Okay. Oops. We'll get this right. So postpartum depression affects 1 in 8 women, sometimes, there we are, who give birth. And it is one of the most common, often unrecognized complications of childbirth. Birth itself is a profound time for all families. It is a marked change, whether it's a first baby or a 5th baby in a family, filled with all kinds of change, excitement, fear, terror. For many families, coming home with a newborn in the car seat in the back is a 3-person job. But it is also something that has the opportunity and the potential to be very stressful. For some families, it becomes devastating. And postpartum depression is common. It is morbid. It affects women, again, as I said, 1 in 7 to 8 women in the general population. During pregnancy, when people have symptoms, it's associated with worse pregnancy outcomes. Postpartum, it is one of the greatest causes of maternal mortality in the world from suicide. And these are the most heartbreaking stories, as well as the stories of mothers that kill their children. And it's often missed. And so this is one of the most heartbreaking things, is that for something that really should be preventable, it is often missed. And that's been a big public health outreach over the last decade is to try and implement screening widely. It affects people around the world. So UNC has a program in Malawi, Africa. I was there a few weeks ago. And if you look at the prevalence of postpartum depression, it is remarkably similar across all countries, all cultures, can be higher in lower income women and in lower income countries because of the additional burden of stress, of poverty, of interpersonal violence, partner violence, and other trauma. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the hormonal changes that occur in pregnancy in all women that give birth and why we think women with postpartum depression may be vulnerable in some way. So if you look at the slide and you look at pregnancy, you will see the rise in estrogen and progesterone labeled E and P. And you will see this marked rise in hormones over the course of pregnancy from the time someone's pregnant through term. This is the greatest rise in these hormones you'll see over the course of someone's life. This is an amazing rise in reproductive hormones that happen in all women that give birth. And then I want you to focus on what happens postpartum. So you see that there's this marked plummet when someone delivers at time 0. And the hormones dramatically fall at this time, leading to what is normally considered a downregulation of hormones in women postpartum. This happens in all women that give birth. So what is it about the women who develop postpartum depression that are sensitive to this drop in hormones that doesn't happen in other women who, everyone that gives birth experiences this? One of the things we think is there may be a genetic vulnerability, that for some women, the trigger for who develops postpartum depression is really based on an underlying genetic vulnerability to that rising and falling in hormones. Again, that happens in everyone, but we know that 10 to 15% of women, or approximately 1 in 7 or 8 women, will develop marked symptoms postpartum. Now, it's worth mentioning that for some people, they've battled depression at other points in their life. These people are more vulnerable to postpartum depression. For some women, they may have developed depression during pregnancy. There can be all sorts of psychosocial issues that may complicate things. So if you go into your pregnancy depressed, if you're depressed during pregnancy, it doesn't markedly get better postpartum when the baby comes. For anyone that's a parent, how many of you are a parent? Okay. Then you know that newborns in general don't take care of themselves. There's generally quite a bit of sleep disruption. People are pretty exhausted, and the birthing process itself is generally, under the best of circumstances, quite arduous. So everyone's going into it feeling fairly vulnerable, pretty exhausted, and depending on social support, complications that came up, the health of the baby, all these things can make it more or less difficult. So while not all women who develop postpartum depression necessarily have a genetic biologic trigger that happens immediately postpartum, we do see women for whom there's no previous mental health history, and there's this marked, like a switch gets flipped postpartum. So I want to share a video next that's called Dark Side of the Full Moon. This is just a trailer, a 2.5-minute trailer that was made by 2 women who survived postpartum depression. They did filming at UNC, among other places in the country. And it, I think, portrays the pain and the anxiety and the depression, but really just the stigma and suffering that so many women and their families experience. And the other thing is that for many women, they can't get help. They will go to their OB and tell them that they're suffering with this. It's often missed. And so up until recently, there has not been adequate awareness. And so our hope today is to share with you some of these women's stories, tell you then about some research we're doing, and help you spread the word so that no one has to suffer in silence.
After dozens of phone calls to psychologists to see if I could get an appointment, which would take weeks, I don't know if I would have survived, honestly, waiting 6 weeks. I needed something right then and there, and I couldn't find it. The help wasn't there.
I would have wanted to be screened. I would have absolutely wanted to be screened. Right away, I knew something is not right.
Hemorrhage is a common postpartum complication. Actually, so is suicide.
45-year-old mother holding her son plunged 8 stories out of an apartment window to her death in an apparent suicide.
She had already driven in off this boat ramp here right into the Hudson River.
These are very real illnesses, and they need to be taken seriously.
This is the gap that we find mothers in all the time. They go to the OB says, oh, you're having a mental health complication, go to the psychiatrist. They go to the psychiatrist, they say, you're pregnant, you've got to go back to the OB. And they're left in this place where they fall through huge cracks.
High blood pressure gets treated, diabetes gets treated. Treating mental health is optional.
I really didn't receive the help I needed, and anything I kind of found on my own was just on the internet.
This is a public health issue. This is not a woman's issue. This affects everybody. It certainly affects her children.
I just wanted help. If anyone would have asked me, I said, yes, I need help.
So Maureen Fura and Jennifer Silliman, who produced that film, have worked very hard to show it across the country. It's been shown here. If you're interested, we can have you arrange for a viewing of it. But they wanted to call attention to the fact that for so many women, there is not the ability to get help. Yesterday, the New York Times ran a piece called, "Can Fathers Have Postpartum Depression?" And a new study came out that showed that men may also have some hormonal changes associated with birth experience that their wives or partners may have. And while I think this is really interesting, we know that rates of depression for men and women are much higher in the postpartum period because of all the stress it brings to families. However, I really see it as apples and oranges. And I think that for women, the process of pregnancy, the marked hormonal changes, and then the process of birthing is entirely different than certainly what men experience. And this is not to say it's not a difficult time for families and for fathers that need support too. Certainly for fathers that have a wife or partner that's struggling with postpartum depression, it's extremely stressful. But I do think it's interesting in terms of the conversation. Can fathers have postpartum depression? I think certainly fathers can have increased risk of depression, but I think it's important we don't try and mix that in with the fact that 1 in 7 or 8 women will have marked mood and anxiety symptoms that can lead to maternal mortality and significant morbidity. Because of this, we were interested, our group at UNC, in trying to understand what is the genetic signature. Is there a way that we could find prospectively or ahead of time who is at risk? Could you identify someone at risk the same way we test in pregnancy for something like gestational diabetes and find out who's at risk so you could intervene ahead of time rather than waiting for someone to deliver and get sick and then try to intervene at that point? So through a long process, we ended up working with Apple Research Kit to develop the Postpartum Depression Act, PPD Act app. Apple developed Research Kit, which is an open source document for anyone to download free on iTunes and participate in a research study. So it's a global smartphone study of postpartum depression. It launched in 2016, and it is the largest genetic study of postpartum depression in the world, trying to understand the interaction of genes and environment. We've had more than 14,000 women who have downloaded the app, and in the US we've sent well over 5,000 spit kits. So someone can download the app, answer clinical screening questions, and then if they agree to participate in the genetic component, we send them a little tube, they spit in it and return. It's similar and just as easy as if you check your genetic ancestry with something like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. One of the most heartwarming things about this is, while not a primary objective, many women have sought treatment. They've used this as a way to screen because there's clinical screening questions. They've used this as a way to screen, and then they have sought help. There's a link in the app to seek help afterwards. And this is a great example, I think, of team science and what we can do when we all work together. So as a clinician researcher and our team with perinatal psychiatry at UNC, we partnered with genetics. We partnered with advocacy groups, including Postpartum Progress and Postpartum Support International. We partnered with the NIH, who donated 10,000 of the spit kits that are returned to the NIH biorepository. We worked with the UNC Center for Innovation. All of this came together to have this app. And if you build an app and no one knows that you have an app, then your app is not particularly useful. And so we were able to get great media outreach. The New York Times was interested, and we launched a big, if you will, media storm that led to CNN, New York Times, worked with Apple, and we ended up with 10,000 women downloading the app in the first month. I think it's worth reporting that most of the women who participated had very severe cases as measured by the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, which makes sense because you have to be fairly motivated and have suffered enough to want to download an app and answer questions. We've had women participate from all 50 states and Guam in the United States. And it has really been an amazing outpouring of people interested in participating in a research study, really an altruistic contribution to help us try and understand this. I want to share with you a letter we received. Some of the women have sent back letters with their spit kits to the NIH biorepository. And a nice guy named Dave at the NIH biorepository will scan and send me these notes. Dear PPD Act, the NIMH, the Rutgers Biorepository researchers, thank you for taking the time, effort, and care to research postpartum depression. As a 34-year-old who had fairly severe PPD with my son, who's now 8, I want to let you know how much I appreciate your work. I remember being scared to leave my baby long enough to pee because someone had convinced me the dog would eat his face off. I couldn't go to the mailbox because I didn't think he could be alone. And she goes on to say how impaired it was. But the terror and the fear that many people experience can be excruciating. She ends with saying, so again, I want to thank you. I know it is hard in your day-to-day science to forget about the impact you can make on each person, but I want you to know how thankful I am for all that you are doing to help better understand PPD. And also, I did get better. I now have a 4-year-old girl and a husband and a new puppy, and that though she occasionally has anxious moments of feeling depressed or anxious, she is now feeling much better and wants us to know that she's okay now. These are heartwarming notes that make us feel motivated to continue to try and outreach. We've received notes from women that suffered with PPD 30 years ago, and no one asked about it. So the majority of women who participated in the study have suffered in the last 6 months to 2 years. But again, because it's a DNA study, it's lifetime history, so anyone can participate. Someone else sent this and said, thank you for doing this study. And I think one of the things that breaks my heart is that this is something that really can be treated. And it is really heartbreaking to have people suffer in silence, to have terrible outcomes, including suicide, for something that can be treated. So I want to tell you about our UNC perinatal psychiatry unit. My wonderful colleague and the director of the unit, Dr. Mary Kimmel, wave Mary, is sitting in the back. We opened the perinatal psychiatry unit in 2011, making it the first unit of its kind in the United States. We say this with the chagrin that this kind of unit opened up in the UK 65 years ago. There are 20 such units in France alone. It's not a surprise necessarily that the United States is behind, because we're the only developed country in the world without universal maternity leave. So we're behind the curve. We think that it made sense to do this, and as our outpatient program got bigger and bigger, we were increasingly frustrated for the percentage of women, albeit the relatively small number, who were suffering enough and ill enough to require hospitalization, but that we didn't have a specialized unit. So if you have a heart attack, you're admitted to the cardiac intensive care unit. If you go to deliver a baby, you're admitted to labor and delivery. And if you have postpartum depression, being mixed in on a general psychiatry unit where it's really not set up for postpartum women is a problem. So our unit, we've worked hard to have it be a home-like atmosphere. It's for pregnant and postpartum women. Feel free to come up front too, you don't have to hide in the back. It is for pregnant and postpartum women. We have specially trained nursing staff, recreation therapy, psychotherapy, yoga, and Dr. Kimmel works very hard to provide really outstanding care with our team to the women that come from across the country. We've become a national referral center for women that suffer with depression, as well as postpartum psychosis, which is much more rare but potentially devastating. And our unit allowed us to have a place to conduct novel research protocols. So I want to tell you a little bit about that next. All right, we'll get there. So I told you at the beginning about hormones, estrogen and progesterone. In all women that give birth, they go up and then they come down quite precipitously at the time of childbirth. One of the metabolites of progesterone is called allopregnanolone, which is a really long word. I'll just call it allo. But it passes the blood-brain barrier. So allopregnanolone is a neuroactive steroid, meaning it has active effect on the brain. And in animal studies, allo has been shown to modulate biologic processes that may go awry or be dysregulated in people with depression. We know it can affect our stress axis. It may cause neuroprotection, may impact immune function. And we also know that when people are treated with antidepressants, that allo levels go up. So we were able to partner with a new biotech company called Sage Therapeutics, who contacted us. They had developed a proprietary formulation of allopregnanolone. And the question was, would we be interested in administering allopregnanolone as an experimental therapy for postpartum depression? It had been studied in other neurologic conditions. There was enough safety data to allow us to feel confident in giving it. And we know that allopregnanolone is markedly elevated in pregnancy and then falls postpartum, because progesterone is elevated in pregnancy and falls postpartum. So the idea was to give third trimester levels of allopregnanolone to postpartum women with severe postpartum depression. We started with an open label study. That means the goal was to start with 10 women who were already admitted to the unit for severe postpartum depression, offer them the opportunity to participate in this study. We suspected that there may be a rapid response because we were giving this IV infusion, but we really didn't know what would happen. And we wanted to see if there was any signal at all. Would women respond at all to this infusion? What happened was we saw this marked, robust response, that people responded within 24 hours. By 60 hours, they were well, and this response persisted over 30 days. And this seemed too good to be true, frankly. So they immediately went to a double-blind study. So half the people got an IV infusion with the active drug, and half the people got an IV infusion with the placebo, and everyone double-blind means no one knows what it is. The patient doesn't know. The doctors don't know. It's blinded except for an investigational drug pharmacist. And again, what we saw with the double-blind study was that the people who got the active drug, the allopregnanolone, which is called brexanolone, had this marked reduction in their depression rating score. This is the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, commonly used in depression clinical trials. And there was this marked, robust response that happened and again persisted to 30 days. This paper came out in June in The Lancet. And there's been a lot of excitement about that. The phase 3 study, which is a much larger version of this double-blind study, just finished. It's now a large multi-site study. So UNC, we were the only study that did the open label. The double-blind study had 4 sites. The phase 3 study that just finished had closer to 50 sites. And everyone's on pins and needles to see, will the phase 2 findings that were published in The Lancet be replicated in phase 3? And we'll all find out in a few weeks. So I think that it's promising, but trying to have a very measured approach. You never know, and many drugs blow up in phase 3. But certainly, it would be a very exciting step forward for postpartum depression, as well as the question everyone wants to know is, does this drug also work for depression outside of the postpartum period? Does it work in men? Does it work in women? And that's being studied by Sage Therapeutics. So I am the academic investigator, the academic principal investigator. So my job is to have no conflict of interest and just be the science person conducting the study. But it will be interesting to see what happens over the next couple months. So nothing can be done without a team of people. We have an amazing clinical team. This is our team that developed the app. And I'm very grateful to have amazing colleagues like Dr. Kimmel in the back, who allow us to do the work that we do at UNC. We really are committed and dedicated to trying to change how we think about women's reproductive mood disorders. We want to develop specialized care. We want to prevent suffering. And ultimately, we want to understand what causes this in the first place. How can we prospectively identify who's struggling, who's suffering ahead of time? So this is our website. We're always happy to take questions. We have many different clinical settings, including 2 in Raleigh, the rest in Chapel Hill. So I will stop here, and we'll be very interested in hearing questions, comments, and having a discussion.
Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very much. All right, so this is where we flip it around. I'm going to bring a microphone around. If you have questions, every now and then just wave your hand. I'll bring a microphone to you, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. I'm going to start right over here.
So while we're still thinking about the last thing you said there, where can we find out how phase 3 comes out with brexanolone?
Yes. So Sage Therapeutics, if brexanolone has positive findings, the people that started Sage are going to be euphoric. It's now publicly traded on the stock market. I will never personally benefit from that, but the people in Sage Therapeutics will, and their investors will. So there'll be a big announcement. So if you put in a good Google alert for Sage Therapeutics and brexanolone, you'll find out in the next few weeks. And then there will be the delay why we have to write and craft the academic publication. But I am sure they will be thrilled. If it's a big bust, there'll be some sort of very sad announcement too, with a lot less fanfare.
This is also very, very interesting and important. Back to more the beginning of your talk and kind of what happens that precipitates postpartum depression and anxiety. You know, I'm wondering about this from an evolutionary perspective, like why evolution has not solved this problem. You know, why we have postpartum depression. It's the same question I have much more trivially about people's response to poison ivy. Why are we susceptible? We're no danger to the poison ivy plants, and dogs, which are a danger to poison ivy, aren't susceptible to it. So why has there not been some sort of selection process over the many generations to eliminate this threat to women and babies. And I think somehow this is tied to the question, why is there such a precipitous drop in these hormones after childbirth, where I guess the increase is gradual through the pregnancy? Why the precipitous drop afterwards? Maybe if it were more gradual, the results for women wouldn't be so bad.
I think that's a fascinating question. I certainly don't know the answer. I've often thought it's a terrible design flaw. And so for women that deliver and become psychotic or with postpartum psychosis or severely depressed within hours to days, I've always thought that's a really cruel joke. There's an amazing book called Hillbilly Elegy. And it's written by a woman who starts off the book saying, there's a tradition in my family, everyone goes mad after giving birth. I thought I would be the one to escape it. And in fact, she wasn't. And so I think that she then talks about her own battle with postpartum psychosis, and it had run in her family. We know that postpartum psychosis has a strong genetic loading. It is more rare, so about 1 per 1,000, but it is horrifying. And so I don't know why, but if you look back in ancient literature, you'll see reports of women who had what was called puerperal psychosis. You'll see reports of women, and people have stories, well, my mother, she couldn't take care of me. She was off somewhere. It makes no sense teleologically. I can make more sense out of why women go through menopause now at 50 when they're living till 80, and that's because we were supposed to be dead. And so I think historically you were born, you got your period, you had babies, and then you were dead. And so now that we just live longer, there's this sort of delay of 30 years postmenopausally. But why women deliver, I think hormonally, once you deliver the placenta, that triggers the fall. And there's not a nice way of regulating it. And for most women, it's not a problem, but it certainly is for some subgroup.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is a really important topic, and I'm glad you and your group are shedding light on it. My question is the new drug, brexanolone. What is the difference between that and traditional antidepressants, and what were some of the symptoms and reactions of the patients in the trial?
It's a great question. So brexanolone is completely different than anything currently on the market, which is, I think, why the pharmaceutical industry is very excited about it. It is an IV formulation right now of allopregnanolone, which is a neuroactive metabolite of progesterone. So it's a neurosteroid. So estrogen and progesterone are the female hormones. Early on in the talk, I showed how they go sky high in pregnancy and then fall. And so unlike for example, Prozac, fluoxetine, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which work on a serotonin neurotransmitter system, this actually is a neurosteroid. It's a hormone, a derivative hormone, very closely linked to the rising, falling hormones of pregnancy. So that makes it markedly different. Now, it works on GABA receptors, both presynaptic and postsynaptic GABA receptors. And that is of great interest because this would be a completely different mechanism for treating depression, which I think there's great interest in if this is positive, because going after postpartum depression initially made sense because of the physiology of pregnancy, but going after depression outside of the perinatal period, if you saw efficacy, would be equally exciting because it would be a completely new way, a new neurotransmitter system, new receptors of treating depression in general.
I would like to build on her question. So I did want to know if there were any PPD specific medications out there, and it sounds like Sage is working on them. If the phase 3 results are positive, are there any plans to do a head-to-head with any of the standard of care medications?
So I think if the phase 3 results are positive, it will unleash a completely new research program. So there are already plans to do a much larger open label trial to get more data on safety and dosing. And so that would be women who are currently suffering. Everyone would get active drug, just get lots of people in, and really understand more about safety and dosing in lots of people. Ultimately, certainly, the head-to-head trial with an effective antidepressant. Now, remember, most of the antidepressants take 4 to 6 weeks to work, and they're effective in about half or a little more of people. So all of these things will need to be studied. And, you know, it's certainly, this is the beginning of what would be a long road, but really interesting questions. In terms of specific medications for postpartum depression, there really aren't. So the traditional antidepressants, there's been a few studies looking at sertraline, Zoloft, and a tricyclic nortriptyline in postpartum depression. There's some specific psychotherapies that have been developed for postpartum depression, which can be very effective. But pharmacologically, some people have used an estrogen patch. And so there's some studies saying if you have a history, that's never used as a first line, but if you have a history, does it make sense as a way of replacing the hormones? And that's been done, but the problem is slapping on an estrogen patch causes some complications, including it may curtail lactation and other potential complications. So it has not been perfect. And again, that's why this led to an interesting sort of way of exploring a new medication.
So we actually have a question from someone watching online.
Yeah, this is from Facebook, Facebook Live. This is from Caroline. And the question is, if the Sage-Brex phase 3 data is promising, how long might it be before a therapy is publicly available to women?
Well, if the phase 3 study were promising, then the company would move towards getting FDA approval. So that is a long road and process. The FDA may come back and ask questions for additional safety data, understanding it further. It is fast-tracked right now. It has fast-track status with the FDA, which is done to try and bring drugs that look promising for conditions that don't necessarily have a particularly effective treatment to market quickly. So I don't know, there's not a specific timeline, but the idea would be to have it happen as quickly as possible. But you're looking, in general, at 1 to 2 years after that.
So you had mentioned a little bit earlier in your talk that postpartum depression has a large part of it could be due to genetics, but then there's also environment that plays into that. Do you treat one of those, or would you treat, I guess because we're not really there yet maybe, but would you treat one of those causes differently in women? So if you look at the genes and you say, oh, genetically you are predisposed for PPD versus an environmental problem.
It's a great question. So I think, you know, everything that we encounter is we bring to it our genetic loading, and then we bring to it our life experience. So whether you have genetic loading for high blood pressure, whether you are a healthy weight and regularly exercise and don't smoke is going to increase or decrease your risk of having horrible high blood pressure. And that goes with everything, including postpartum depression. If you knew someone was genetically vulnerable, then in theory what you would want to do is you would take a more proactive, preventive approach. And you would know they were high risk, so you would either treat prophylactically in some way to prevent them from getting sick. And that's actually a really interesting question, and people have asked, would you use this medicine if brexanolone worked to infuse people prophylactically? Getting back to your question, if you knew someone was vulnerable and you knew it was due to hormonal flux, would you try and intervene earlier? I think the answer is yes, but that's, you know, requires the next study and the data. However, all the psychosocial factors are critically important. So our life events alter our genes, which is called epigenetics. We know that women that have childhood trauma histories or adult trauma histories, abuse histories, are at greater risk. If you have supportive family and partner that can make things better. If you don't, it can make things markedly worse. And many of the patients we see, there's complex family issues, social issues, and so all of those things have to be factored into the equation. So Dr. Kimmel and our team in our inpatient and outpatient program, we really try and look at the whole, if you will, 360 approach to all these factors, because it's not often just treating the symptoms and then it's all perfect. For example, if a woman has been really depressed, she may not have had the opportunity to bond with her baby, what's called attachment, in an ideal way. And we know there's studies that have shown that even if you treat the depression later, mom may feel better, but the attachment may still be impaired. And this can cause horrible guilt, alter the relationship with the child over the course of their life. So I can tell you that when we went to an international perinatal depression meeting in France in 2012, one of the perinatal units in France, their major focus, and France is still very psychoanalytic, still very Freudian psychoanalytic, was really on attachment. I mean, even more so than how mom was doing. It was on the mother-infant attachment, because we know if you have good attachment, the child will have better development over the course of their life. And just to share one funny vignette, the mother-baby unit in France was beautiful, and there was this beautiful sort of day room eating area where everyone would gather for meals in a beautiful kitchen, and all the mothers would cook together, and the babies live in a well-baby unit on the nursery. That's not able to happen in this country because insurance would never pay for a well-baby nursery on a psychiatry unit here. So moms come and go, and we have families stay, and we do the best we can. But the team in France was giving us a tour, and they said, we know a mother's ready to go when she has planned a meal. We take her out to shop for the meal, and as she has cooked the meal on the unit for all the other mothers. And I thought, dear God, no one would ever be discharged in the United States if that was the criteria for discharge, because for many people, they couldn't cook when they came in. And then certainly planning a 5-course French meal on the way out the door was not going to be part of the deal. So I think cultural differences, but understanding all the family dynamics are critically important.
Great talk. Thank you so much. Is there a focus on women who have a familial history of PPD, and if not, should there be?
It's a great question. There absolutely should be. And I think one of the frustrations is that it's often not screened for at all. So if you deliver a baby at UNC, you will be screened for during pregnancy, and you will be screened postpartum. They will ask you about your symptoms. You'll be asked to fill out a rating form. The Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale is a common one. There's a bunch of them, 10 items. You can Google it. You can download it. You can send it to your friend. You can download our app, which is now in iOS, in Android, and in Spanish, in the United States, in Australia, and in Canada so far. But you can go 10 minutes down the road to a different practice setting, and they're never going to ask you anything about it. I mean, not once. They won't ask you if you're having symptoms, and they certainly won't ask you if your mother did, or your sister did, or your grandmother did. And that's just heartbreaking, because if we know that, then in theory you should be monitored during pregnancy differently, and in the postpartum differently. You should receive psychoeducation about it. It shouldn't be something people are trying to wonder what's going on. So one of the things that's so frustrating is that people have such guilt and shame. So women will be very happy to talk about birth experiences and whether they had an epidural or a C-section or whatever happened, but no one will want to talk about the fact that they're feeling miserable. They're thinking this is the worst thing that ever happened to them, and they're so anxious they're about ready to come out of their skin. So they'll suffer in silence, terrified to tell their partner, really terrified to tell their mother-in-law, who may not have liked them even from the beginning, and now they really aren't going to like them. And so there's also a pressure on women to look like they have it all together. So I've seen people who are convinced they're the only ones that have it, and they'll say, I know so-and-so down the street who seems like she has it fine, and I have to resist the urge, because Chapel Hill's not that big, to say, oh, actually, so-and-so's actually a hot mess, and we saw her in clinic 3 hours earlier. So I don't care how she looked in the grocery store, but, she's suffering too. So it is, getting around the stigma of mental health, but certainly getting all providers to see it as something that absolutely should be part of routine care.
How do you tell as a family member that someone's experiencing depression, not just some normal mood swing associated with pregnancy and birth?
It's a great question. We were actually talking about that earlier. So it really has to do with the frequency and the severity of the symptoms. So in general, if someone is having symptoms that are really making them miserable, whether it can be what we call postpartum depression often includes a lot of anxiety. So there's a real move in the field to call it postpartum mood and anxiety disorders. If they're feeling so anxious they're coming out of their skin, if they're feeling down and blue and depressed, or if they're not enjoying things, they're not enjoying the baby, they don't want to do things they usually did, we call that anhedonia, which is loss of interest or pleasure. If it's impairing their functioning in some way, then we see that as being clinically significant. Certainly if someone is having thoughts that life is not worth living, that's always a red flag. But really we're looking for some marked change in functioning. No one thinks the postpartum period is easy, but you shouldn't be utterly miserable. And for first-time moms, they often have no sense of how it's supposed to be. And that can be really, really hard. It's often another family member, a grandmother, a neighbor, a friend, a cousin that comes over and says, you know, this isn't going okay. If someone is terrified to be alone with the baby, if someone's, you know, finding it impossible to kind of, you know, do their thing, or if they utterly look miserable, those are all indications that you need to get help.
So I have a question. If a person doesn't get help, how often, how easy, or how long does it take for people to come back to being normal again, or do they? Or that's my question.
It's a great question. So untreated depression, whether in the postpartum period or at any other time of someone's life, a woman or a man, eventually it usually resolves over time, but that can go on for 6 months, a year, or longer. And for some people, the postpartum period is a trigger for what becomes a more persistent and more difficult to treat depression. The longer things are untreated, sometimes the harder it can be to treat. The other thing is that, and why I think those of us that work in this field find it so rewarding, is that you have the ability to impact both mom and baby. And so when you're dealing with someone who's just had a baby, and for the family, if it's not treated in a timely way, then the mom is sick longer. We know that depressed moms may have more difficulty, certainly not always at all, and many depressed mothers work very hard to be wonderful. But you may not be as interactive with your baby or detached from your baby. It can impair attachment. All these things can cause long-term problems for the baby and the child over time. So there was an Australian study a couple years ago that showed the children of mothers with postpartum depression actually had worse outcomes if you follow them through 18 years than earlier. And so I think that is the imperative in my mind for why it's so critical to intervene and treat.
I have a dreaded two-part question, but I'll try to make the bridge for you. First, is this considered a single diagnosis like in DSM, or is it, does it have subclasses? You're saying yes, it's a single.
So well, no, it's a great question. Right now, it is a subtype in the DSM under major depression. And so it gets even more complicated than that, because in DSM-4, it was postpartum only within the first 4 weeks postpartum. And in DSM-5, it's now peripartum, so onset anytime during pregnancy and postpartum, which in many ways was done from a public health point of view just to be really inclusive. From the point of view of trying to figure out the biologic trigger and intervene, it's really complicated. So I don't think that lumping it all together makes sense in terms of understanding the biology. Lumping it all together in terms of trying to make all women who have symptoms in pregnancy or postpartum get screened and identified. And the U.S. Services Preventative Task Force came out a year ago saying that there was sufficient evidence to recommend screening for all women during pregnancy and postpartum. So that's great from a public health point of view. But then you have to have a way of having people who are screened, making sure they're getting into treatment, and then having adequate treatment.
The second part has to do with insurance. If I were advising someone to get treatment and to try to, if they are lucky enough to have insurance, Should I go one way or the other, or is there any parity whatsoever with other mental problem? You know.
It's a great question. So, if you get slapped with a major depression diagnosis, it does cause people difficulty. And so I will use, as will many of my colleagues will often use, adjustment disorder with depressed and anxious features as, if you will, a way of mitigating what I think is the outrageous negative sequelae of having a major depression diagnosis. And actually, the Wall Street Journal did a piece on that a year ago saying, if we're telling everyone to get screened, and then there's going to be negative retribution of having everyone get slapped with a depression diagnosis and the insurance companies, you then, for many people, don't actually get life insurance until you have a child, and then you say this is a pre-existing condition. So that really seems unfair, doesn't it? But I think that that is one of those socio-political things that we can't be naive to. And if you're taking care of patients, that you have to figure out how you're going to have conversations about it. What are you going to call it? So you'll see when you try and do prevalence studies, it's sometimes challenging because not everyone's called major depression in the postpartum period. It can be anxiety disorder. It can be anxiety unspecified. It can be adjustment disorder. It can be any number of things where sometimes it depends on who the clinician is, what they're trying to accomplish. So it really can muddy the waters.
For women who suffer depression pre-birth, is there a hormonal trigger for that, or is that just not well understood at this point?
It's a great question. So I think that some women develop depression during pregnancy, and it is felt that it can be any number of things. So for example, there's higher rates of depression in women that have hyperemesis, horrible nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. If you find out that there's an anomaly in the baby, if you find out that your husband or partner has run off with someone down the street, if you find out any number of things that can increase your risk for, any kind of difficulty coping. But certainly for some women, the rise and fall of hormones is problematic. So we know that the greatest point prevalence seems to be acutely postpartum, but pregnancy also is complicated. And I think we're just really trying to understand. The one thing we do understand now is that you can't lump everything all together, and one size is not going to fit all for treating. So really trying to parse that out further is going to be important.
I remember at the beginning of that talk, you mentioned that postpartum depression is easy to be prevented and treated. So my question for you is, as non-professionals, what's your suggestion on how can we prevent from getting it?
Yes, it's a great question. So I think that one of the best things to do is to ideally going into pregnancy with good social supports, feeling as well as possible. And then I think just making sure, for some people, it's not like you're doing anything wrong and there's no magic way of preventing it. Again, most people don't have it. So that's the good news. I think that just having regular screening, and certainly if you were starting to have any symptoms, if you're having symptoms during pregnancy, making sure you're reaching out and getting help. And so I think just being aware of it and monitoring it is really the best way of making sure that people get taken care of. So, there's some things we can prevent by lifestyle choices and other things that we have no control over at all.
Hi, I have a question about, so there's a high correlation between family members having depression. I guess, can you comment on that? And then on the same mother having multiple children, if she has postpartum depression for one of those births, is there a high probability to having the PPD again?
So family history of depression, and in particular of postpartum depression, increases any individual's risk, but doesn't increase it to an absolute at all. It's all incremental increased risk. But if every woman in your family had postpartum depression, that would make someone take pause, in the same way that if every woman in your family had breast cancer, you'd be concerned, right? It's just that, for some breast cancers you can have a genetic test, but we only understand probably some small percentage, BRCA1 being probably the tip of the iceberg for that, right? However, If you've had a personal history of depression before, then that's something that increases your risk. Again, more than the general population, but not absolute. If you've had postpartum depression once and you go into another pregnancy, your risk goes up to about 25% rather than being 10 to 15%. So again, it's not 100% at all. The risk of having a recurrent episode of postpartum psychosis is higher. That seems to be more highly correlated, and it's thought that it has more of a stronger, perhaps, genetic component. But again, it is one of those things I really think knowledge can be power, and certainly being monitored. If you know you're potentially at higher risk, having closer monitoring that can allow someone to start treatment much earlier as needed, or consider, for people that have had it before, starting treatment in pregnancy to prevent postpartum depression.
Let's give Samantha one more round of applause.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and honor to talk with all of you.
So tell us again, if people want more information and resources, what should they look up?
Yes. So if they want more information and resources, they should come to our website. And on our website, you can find out about our outpatient program, our wonderful inpatient unit directed by Dr. Kimmel. You can find out about our research. And you'll also see our email addresses, and we're happy to take emails. I'm very grateful for all of you for coming tonight, and hope that this conversation will allow you to reach out and hopefully help someone else who may be suffering in silence, and allow them to get the help they need and deserve. So thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, having a discussion with us about this important topic. And I have to confess, I think I misspoke at the beginning. It's not just a problem for women, it's a societal issue. So that's on me. But thank you all for coming out to the Science Cafe tonight, so that you all know next Thursday night here at the Science Cafe, there won't be one. So next Thursday, we won't see you. We'll see you 2 weeks from now for Science Trivia. Get your team, come out, have a great time, grab a drink, get dinner. It'll be Science Trivia on first Thursday night of November. Until then, have a great time, everybody. Good night.